for me on my farm in the Finger Lakes, if I'm going to plant a European bittersweet from now forward, it's Porter's Perfection, Harry Masters Jersey, Stoke Red. Period.
Hello, my name is Rio Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider Emcee of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into this year, episode 356, was Eric Shatt of Redbyrd Cider Biodynamic Orchard, which is based in the Finger Lakes region of New York. You're going to be hearing from Eric and a whole roundtable discussion on holistic fruit growing. And it's, once again, from the Maine Apple Camp, and once again will blow your mind, as it did mine, because it was just so insightful and a lovely, lovely conversation. So that's going to be our featured presentation this week. And before we get there, well, I have a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. In last week's episode 355, you will hear a recap from CiderCon 2023, which took place in Chicago. And you'll also hear a little bit about Chicago Cider Week and Chicago Cider Summit. In fact, there is a live stream right now available for view at the Cider Chat YouTube channel. And in session 1, right in the beginning, you'll be able to see the winner of the Escancera pour competition. And that is a high pour where you hold a bottle of Cider, which is a Spanish cider, over your head. It's in a classic green bottle. There's a whole history to Spanish cider if you don't know about it, and I highly recommend going to Spain and visiting there if you want to celebrate cider every night. They know how to do it. And the winning pour of this over-the-head bottle with a glass in front, actually off to the side because it was a really elegant pour, is Olivia Yee of Brooklyn Cider House, and we had that streaming live right behind us. So definitely check out the Cider Chat YouTube channel. It's a place that you could get the podcast weekly, and there's also some shorts and other videos. Definitely subscribe, because it certainly helps this podcast get out into the world and touchstone for people who otherwise don't know about Cider Chat. So if you love this podcast and you want to support it one way or the other, a great way to do that is by following Cider Chat on YouTube. And everywhere else, too, of course, because, I put a little bit of news here, I put a little news there. It's kind of like making cider. I'm still catching up from my week in Chicago. I feel like definitely refreshed and renewed and getting stoked about this year, 2023, which feels so good after being hunkered down for so long. Anywho, we're going to take a little break here. When I come back, I'll tell you a little bit about our sponsor. Sweet, crisp, fresh, or balanced, whatever the cider you want to make, you will find the right yeast for your favorite cider in the Saft Cider range by Fermentis. This week, let's discover AB1 Saft Cider. AB1 stands for Apple Balanced. This yeast is the right choice for balanced cider. It ensures a very good assimilation of fructose and excellent for low-gravity ciders, which results in a delicate aroma profile combining fresh and elaborate fruit notes with a balanced mouthfeel respecting cider structure. Saft Cider AB1 will suit for all types of balanced ciders, even under difficult fermentation conditions. Want to explore diversity of cider profiles? Discover it through the selection of yeast strains visiting their website, fermentis.com. That's spelled FERMETIS.com. Up next, it's time to grab a glass and enjoy this featured presentation that was pre-recorded at Maine Apple Camp 2022. And the topic is Holistic Fruit Growers Roundtable.
My name's Glen Koehler. I work for UMaine Cooperative Extension. So we've got a series of about 5 questions talking about holistic fruit growing. We'll go through a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and then we'll come back to the questions. And I guess we'll just get started. So the first question is, how did you get into holistic fruit growing, and what was your path to get there?
Hi, I'm Jason Maanka. I work with Know Your Roots. We're a small crop and orchard consultant business based in Trumansburg, New York, right outside of Ithaca. I worked there with Mike Biltonen. I've been there about 4 years, and I got really lucky. A number of years ago, I had started out studying environmental studies, and then I had gotten introduced to the alternative agricultural scene in the Finger Lakes and got really interested in that, and then moved away, and then knew I needed to come back and get back into it, and the timing just worked out where I got introduced to Mike Biltonen and worked with him on my weekends, got to know what he was working on, and I either convinced him that he should hire me or he convinced me I should quit my job. So we got lucky and started working with each other. We work with a lot of different clients throughout the Northeast, largely focus on kind of holistic-minded or even holistic hopeful orchards and different farms. And it's only really grown from there. Been able to learn a tremendous amount through working with him and all the different people that we get to see throughout the work that we do.
Hello, I'm Eric Shatt from Redbyrd Orchard in the Finger Lakes, and I've been at growing cider apples for 18 years with the intention mostly of getting into the cider world, which happened in 2010, and I came out of the wine industry and many years of working with grapes and wine in the Finger Lakes, and then more recently at Cornell University's Research Orchard and Vineyard, which I left in 2020. So I think an important piece that I hope we discuss is kind of just the everyone has their own path, and my path was 15 years of small farming along with working off farm, and it took that long to get to being economically sustainable, and that's a pretty important piece, I think, for orcharding, as it's very challenging, right, as we know. And here we are today. I have 5 acres of orchard and a small family, 3 kids. I like to think that I'm incorporating animals and growing vegetables as well, so it's kind of a holistic farm in a way, where the cider is the main, economic component. Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
I'm Laura Seeger. I work at Maanka now, and Maanka. I kind of got into apples by accident. I messed up my back pretty good working on a veggie farm for 2 short seasons, and I happened to take a class in college about apples in Maine and the history of apple growing. And then I was urged to do an internship with John and Cammie in Palermo. And after a few years working with John and learning about apples, there sort of happened to be a position available to start caring for the orchard that John got planted. That was started in 2013, and it has evolved ever since. And I'm at Maanka full time through the growing season, and I collect scion wood for Fedco in the winter and do a little pruning. So that's where I am. My back is in good shape now.
I'm Kevin Clark. Manage the orchards at Rose Hill Farm in Red Hook, New York, in the Hudson Valley there. And I actually moved up from Florida in 2017 and got a job there just working there, running the weed whackers or putting up signs or some pruning. And then at the end of the season, the manager retired, and so then everyone was looking at me. But I was really confused, especially coming from Florida. I'd never had apples, cherries, peaches, blueberries, those sorts of things other than from the supermarket. And it was very confusing, but that winter, talking with Mike Biltonen, and then I read Michael Phillips, The Apple Grower. In that book, he really explains the orchard year, and then it helped make that whole past year make a lot more sense. And from there, I just fell in love with the place and nurturing the trees, and grateful to be here. Thank you.
All right, so here's the big question, and maybe we'll get past this and maybe we won't, but that's why we're here. So the question is, how do you define holistic fruit growing? What is in and what is out?
This is Jason Maanka of Know Your Roots.
I think the big thing about holistic fruit growing is really to take the whole systems approach to it, and looking at just about everything that's going on in your farm, and not just focusing on your crop, because you really want to be able to create a full, healthy, resilient, and biodiverse ecosystem that's going to benefit both the surrounding farmscape that you have and the health of your crop. So really making sure you're working to leverage those systems to increase the fertility of your farm, use the natural pest systems to decrease any sort of pest and disease load, and really bring what you're trying to do up to another level without having to put in too many human impacts or interventions, and to really be able to use that whole ecosystem in your farm to minimize what you're going to have to do and any sort of detrimental effects that agriculture is going to have on either the farm or the ecosystem as a whole. I think that's where endpoints can really make a big difference in what you're actually able to do. I think one, if you're starting off from the beginning and you have this whole holistic fruit growing thing in mind, you're going to be able to do a lot more to build that whole system, versus taking over a old historically conventional farm that has really been put into a whole different level that now needs to be brought back up. So stuff like cider is going to be able to tolerate a lot more pressure and disease, and it's not going to have to look as good. Whereas if you're selling, healthy, or you want to sell really nice looking fruit, you might be limited in how much you can actually accomplish in the same way.
Eric Shatt, Redbyrd Cider, Biodynamic Orchard.
Yeah, well said. And I think also part of holistic farming includes just holistic well-being as a human. What you're doing, what you're working with, the people you're interacting with. So the word holistic can be attached to agriculture, to environmental stewardship, to respecting animal and plant life, to having a strong, vibrant community of people. It can be completely within yourself of, yes, I'm happy doing these things, and therefore that's a positive attribute. So I think we can include holistic in many different aspects of what it means to be small farmers, or any kind of farmers for that matter. And I think what's in and what's out is a tough question. I think you could maybe make arguments that essentially anything or most things can be included as long as they have the viewpoint and the idea of the betterment of everything in mind. For instance, nice stands of goldenrod may be competing for water with apple trees, but they're a beautiful source of nectar for honeybees and wild bees. So that's a great, very simple example of sort of just thinking about everything involved. And the hard part, I think, about holistic farming is that we all know farming is challenging economically. The more you think less and less about the economic sustainability of a farm, the further you move towards holistic. So it's really, it's always an interplay. And I think that's the balance that we all strive for.
Laura Seeger, Maine Heritage Orchard.
It is. I think of holistic growing as, well, like Jason said, not just focusing on the crop as the outcome, but the plants and their environment, the whole biome there. Not just the trees need to survive, but what everything there, how those interactions are taking shape. And so we do a lot to foster those relationships between the plants. It can be hard to justify the time spent doing things that don't have a clear outcome. I have a really, really fortunate position where we're not looking for high quality, perfect dessert fruit. We're like growing cyanwood. We're just sort of the purpose of the Heritage Orchard at Maanka is to have a preservation of varieties, to have this like gene bank, and to be able to share cuttings to grow other trees. And so that has its own challenges with viruses and diseases and and just the challenges of keeping trees alive in clay and sand soils without irrigation. But the focus from the very beginning has been on a whole systems approach, and the fruit trees are just one small component of this land reclamation project in a way. And so we spend a lot of our time observing what seems to be going well, what sort of relationships are taking hold and benefiting the fruit trees or the companion plants. While I like to think that we have few human interventions, the reality is that there's a ton of human intervention. Like the whole thing is touched by people, and we spray the trees. We bring in a lot of stuff. But also like the orchard is doing a lot of the work itself. There's like a lot of the native plants are self-seeding. We've stopped trying to force things to grow there that aren't growing there. I do also think about the components of our orchard that are lacking, like what's missing, and I think that silvopasture is probably the answer to any holistic orchard system, is like a complete nutrient cycle of having animals in the orchard. We haven't figured that out for our site, though we talk about it every day.
Kevin Clark, Rose Hill Farm.
I'm really happy Eric said that, because I think I see an orchard as one of the confluences where culture and nature intersect. So it's not just a natural place. And we, like Laura was saying, we're doing a lot of work and manipulation, and like to think of it as curating a crop. It's about 3/4 of the season. We're still out in the orchard working with the trees. I'm a forgetter, so I forget that there's when fruit come on the trees, I'm like, holy shit, there's fruit on these trees that I love so much. And, the owner of the orchard's like, yeah, there better be fruit on the trees. And for holistic management, going back to what Eric, it's like how we as people working on the land approach it. And one of the things I strive for daily is am I approaching it with humility? What's my intention? Am I paying attention? Do I have a level of joy in the work that I'm doing, and hoping to foster the environment with the other people working with us to do that.
Kevin, you kind of touched on this, and we were kind of planning to go into this a little bit anyway. The metaphysical aspects of holistic management, what's beyond sort of the economic context or the production context. Did you want to speak to that?
After a couple of years of working in the orchard, I realized the physiology of the trees is what it really strikes my inner being. It's so I try to understand as many of the processes of the trees and the land itself as I can, and take baby steps in learning that, because I believe the trees want us to see them. there's a relationship between the humans and the trees. We have a pick your own orchard, so it's, you got to have the people there to keep the whole thing going. But sometimes it's too much to see the people, and they're having a good time, so that's great. But as a farmer, try to put eyes on the tree and see them for what they are and what they're doing in correspondence with everything else that's driving that.
Eric Shatt, Redbyrd Cider, Biodynamic Orchard.
Well, I just was thinking kind of about what John said last night as far as understanding that plants are intelligent. It's a really good mindset to have in a farming practice that doesn't put money profitability at the top. What Holistic does is it puts your relationship with the farm as one of the most important aspects. And so if we respect the plants, or if we recognize that they are intelligent, which goes beyond logical thinking and more towards intuitive thinking, that I think is a really important frame of mind. Is that metaphysical? I don't know.
Jason Maanka of Know Your Roots.
I think that's all like pretty key to a lot of this, is where you're focusing on everything and you're really trying to like bring the farm to another level, you're trying to bring yourself to another level, and then like your interaction with those farms. And I think as long as you're really striving to really, make those connections and have those like understandings with what's going on, that's really like one of the biggest part, is just continually to strive to make things better in whatever way you can, like regardless of how you're going about managing your farm.
Kevin and I talked about this a few weeks ago. Been thinking about like the attitude I bring to the orchard, because for a bunch of years, it was like every day that I was there, even the days where it was overwhelming, it was like a really joyful experience to just be around these trees that were, somehow living in these kind of brutal conditions. And I've been fortunate enough to like work alongside John for a bunch of years. And so the early days, like weeding trees in the orchard, I got to hear about like what these varieties were and where the people who sort of passed them on to John and the people before that. And my relationship with the trees has definitely like evolved over time. A lot of the trees in our orchard are like kind of suffering right now. I was talking with a group of people about this maybe a month or two ago, and somebody told me that the trees are going to do what they're going to do, and they're pretty much fine without us, which I know, but sometimes I feel there's like a lot more. I put pressure on myself to foster their like well-being. And she said, you can go and be around the trees, and they take your stress and they turn it into food. I was like, oh yeah. So it's we bring a lot to whatever environment we're working in or living in or existing in. But I think there's feeling that I get when I go to the orchard, especially if I'm like not there for 2 or 3 days in a row. I get there and I just sort of feel this like sense of being at home and being at peace. And the trees I like have been able to observe for years now, and it's really cool to see trees that I think like, oh man, that's a goner. The main trunk died from fire blight, and like we cut it all out, and then the next year it just like regrows all these shoots and it looks fine. We can't really understand, but we can begin to observe. The companion planting at our orchard, I think, is a really big deal too. And sometimes I look at stuff and I'm like, why do we plant this apple tree on top of that elderberry? This is ridiculous. But then like that tree looks really good. So there's also all these relationships, all these interactions that are, I don't really think they're like quantifiable. They're just, but they're there for us to learn from. I get a lot out of the orchard in that way.
How do you resolve the economics and the damage criteria with an interest in being holistic?
Kevin Clark.
Back in 2018, we took a very conventionally managed orchard, and we're like, we're going to do this thing organically. So we cold turkey all synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. We didn't make very much money that year. by summer, we had defoliated whole blocks, and there may be tiny little matsu hanging up there. There were still some apples and some trees, but there was a lot of rot, like in the stone fruit, brown rot city. We ended up having to close down a few weeks earlier than typical. The owners, they're really great about it, but they're like, we can't keep trying this experiment. We also didn't know the health of the orchard, how many trees we had killed. We're always trying to find that balance between what to spray and when. We do spray, synthetic stuff earlier in the season, and that model has worked out a lot better than the other alternative. That's my experience with it. One that's kind of based off of economics.
Our orchard is not really based on economics, but we are at a point of just trying to figure out how to adequately staff and budget for the orchard to keep the trees alive, and really just working towards finding some efficiencies. The orchard is set up in a terraced pit. Nothing about it is efficient, and so we're sort of at this tipping point where we need to decide is the land preservation the project, and can that happen at the same time as having a gene bank for these varieties, or do we need to sort of pivot and have the land reclamation project be one thing and plant out some flat straight rows of some semi-dwarfs and multiples of each and just put the rarest of the collection on flat ground, and how do we staff that? The orchard is entirely funded by donors pretty much, and it's a fun project, and so it gets a lot of people involved in that way, but our sort of economic thing is how do we model organic growing and trial some new holistic minded practices while trying to lose as few trees as possible, and yeah.
Eric Shatt, Redbyrd Cider, Biodynamic Orchard.
Obviously, as everyone knows here, one of the paths of least resistance is creating a shelf-stable product, whether that's hard cider or frozen sweet cider or vinegar or apple jam or apple syrup. The variability of harvests is flattened out by having storable products. And so for us, that was cider and still is cider. And we had a beautiful, huge crop last year, and I intend to try to sell half of that and then carry over the other half to supplement the very small crop that I have on the trees right now. So that's in my eyes, the real economic benefit of producing hard cider with a small family business where holistic orcharding is very, very important. That is what carries it through. So if we were selling fresh fruit at the farmer's market, it wouldn't be working. The preservability of the cider is what makes it work. So that is super, super important. And I think the other big piece is not putting all your eggs in one basket. We planted dwarf tall spindle, we planted semi-dwarf, we planted seedling trees, we planted trees from seed. We did a lot of European cider apples, and now a lot of them I wouldn't recommend to be grown anymore in the Northeast, aside from a few, as well as other heirlooms too. So by not putting all your eggs in one basket, not only with rootstocks and planting systems and varieties, you can over time see what works best for your specific site. And I think that's the most important piece of advice that I can offer on starting an orchard or continuing to grow as an orchardist.
This is Jason Maanka of Know Your Roots.
For just the health of your orchard, there may be a lot of places where you're not going to be able to cut back, or not be able to cut back in the way you want to go in a different direction. As Kevin said, they didn't just give up and just go back to what they weren't hoping to do. They're continually trying things out and trying to find where that balance is. And if you can find that balance and then start incorporating other things in, because there's a lot of different ways that you can start to set up your orchard or add different things into it that can also help to increase just the diversity or some other aspect of it. Don't just become complacent if things aren't working out. And where possible, trying to really understand what the risks are if you are to change anything, and then trying to figure out like how you can start to experiment with different things to like move in a different direction, or to like minimize those risks if you were to move in a different direction. I think is really important because there's just going to be a whole lot of different things you can try out, and so just trying to make sure that you can really understand what it is you may or may not be able to do or get away with.
Eric, you mentioned cider varieties that aren't working for you. There's a lot of cider interest here. Which varieties are that, and what do you have to say about them?
In the Northeast, all throughout the Northeast, we've been experimenting with lots of varieties now for 20 years. European varieties, heirlooms, wild seedlings, all this cool stuff. So we've been, I feel like we've all kind of grown up in this incredible time period where we have had this ability to really discover all these, how do they work? And now I think we're kind of whittling down, especially when we have really bad fire blight seasons like we did this year in New York. The upside to a really bad fire blight season is you see which varieties fare better than others. For me, on my farm in the Finger Lakes, if I'm going to plant a European bittersweet from now forward, it's Porter's Perfection, Harry Masters Jersey, Stoke Red, period. And that throws out probably 40 different varieties. So that's and then with heirlooms, Roxbury Russet, Golden Russet, any Russet is, I think, superior for cider quality. And also they tend to be more disease resistant for both fungally and insect. I feel like insects don't like the russet, or maybe the skin is too hard. So, if you're going to plant 5 varieties, the other one I'll mention is Redfield, which is also really disease resistant. And I have collected a lot of wild seedling apples that continue to show incredible disease resistance. Gnarled Chapman, Barnhill Sharp, Redbird Bitter. I know a lot of other people have them as well. And, as we know, the natural selection process is happening in nature, and, we're fortunate enough to be working with these varieties. So that's where I'm at, and it's continuously evolving, obviously, and different regions have different challenges. The last thing I'll mention is I just think it's also really important as an orchardist to think that your orchard is never permanent. If you decide to plant 10 varieties on 100 different trees, in 20 years, you might have added 5 different varieties, taken away 5 varieties with top working. We can think. I think we have the fortunate ability to change an orchard over, where you can't do that with other crops, but with orchards. So I think having that mindset that your orchard is never set. It's never permanent. The root system might be, but...
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was going to say, is that you're always realize that your orchard can evolve over time. And so just being able to pay attention to where things are working or where things are not working. And I think, as Eric was saying, that we've definitely whittled down a lot of different varieties that, especially like either a low spray, like holistic system, or like just different areas of the U.S., they're just not going to work. And so you really do need to just think about if you're going to either adapt your trees or you're going to adapt your system to make that all work together. And should really not be afraid to think about how you can either change or top work or any of those other things to make the trees maybe fit more into your system, and instead of trying to figure out the system that is going to work on your trees if your trees just may not work here.
Well, that comment about it not being permanent reminds me of something Jim Shoup, who used to be the Maine state pomologist, said, that this is for commercial dessert fruit industry, but he said if an orchardist isn't thinking 5 years ahead, they're not really thinking. And the recommendation is to renovate 5% of your orchard per year because you've got a 20-year turnover. So that all makes sense. Having said that, I'm getting a little bit old and crotchety, but the pace of change in the commercial dessert fruit industry is with rootstocks and super dwarfing and high density and these fruiting walls and pruning by machine that just runs down with a hedge. it's just getting a little too fast for my taste. But because just one implication of that is the number of leaves per fruit. Now they're actually counting the number of leaves that feeds each fruit, and it's getting down to the point where it really changes the balance, because it used to be 50, 60 leaves per fruit, and I've heard discussion of 8 leaves per fruit. Well, what does that do to your sensitivity to mites and other things? But anyway, just one follow-up on that was, when you talk about holistic, do you use published criteria, or is it your gut sense? Do you use OMRI list? Do you use USDA organic? How do you define which materials, assuming you do have, well, that's another question. Do you spray at some point, and what are your criteria for the products that you would spray and when you would use them? Anybody want to touch that? Laura looks ready to go. I'll put you on the spot, but.
I've learned a lot more about insecticides and bactericides and fungicides this year than I probably thought that I would a few years ago. There are a bunch of springs at the Stump Sprouts Roundtable gathering that I just sort of was like, cool, we don't have to spray that, we don't have that, Marcinina, Cueva Double Nickel, not for me. And now we've we have all the problems. I've seen so many new pests this year. We got every kind of borer. We're also working with Built-In and Know Your Roots, and so we get all our spray recommendations from Mike. And while our orchard is not certified organic, we use OMRI listed or things that would be certifiable organic. Sometimes deciding what to spray and when is, do we have time, and can we make that spray happen? And also part of it is what can the trees handle? Our trees in the Heritage Orchard are for the most part young, and some of them are getting to a size where they feel like they're established and they can handle a little more pressure. But when the trees are 1 to 3 or 4 years old, just a week of getting nailed by any one pest can be devastating and can totally defoliate a tree. And so we spray BT, we spray spinosad products, sprayed a lot of Cueva and Double Nickel this year for fire blight. We pay attention to the label rates and to how many applications a year and all of that. But I'm envious of systems where the sprays are none or are really infrequent. Well, I guess it was 2020 or 2021. We had a really light crop and also sort of a strange summer. Didn't spray much. I think we sprayed 8 times during the season, and the trees looked okay, but they suffered. And we've sprayed way more than 8 times this year. Lauren's done a bunch of the sprays. I'm always talking with Built-In about how much you can put in the spray tank. I'm what else can we put in there? Can I add this to the if we're spraying fermented plant teas and EM1? I'm so can I also throw in some Pyganic? And he's just throw in the concrete and never spray again, Laura. It's too much stuff. It's always too much stuff in the spray tank. Ideally, we would be focusing on foliar feeds and sticking to some of those core holistics that Michael Phillips came up with and wrote about, and stuff that Built-In is continuing to look into and adapt. But it's a balance for us of what's worth our time. Things like Surround, which need several applications, and in a rainy spring, that's really hard to do when we need 3 spray tanks and it takes 3 or 4 hours to apply 1 tank. Is that worth our time for the result we're getting when we don't need perfect fruit? It's more worth it to try setting traps and monitor for pests and spray appropriately for that, or just focus on getting the fire blight under control as best we can. It's every year is a puzzle. But we do try to stick to organic listed, or we have so far always stuck to organic listed, and that's a MAFCA commitment.
In a season with a spray program, it's very difficult to navigate. A lot of research and thinking and back and forth. Scab is relatively easy to control organically. Cedar apple rust is still a mystery. But then, there's a lot of times where you rotate it with an organically approved spray, and then, a lot of times we try to lengthen the intervals of sprays and see how that works. I always think of like trying to find the line. I know that's vague, but I'll leave it at that.
One of my new orcharding goals is I want to have a no spray orchard, and I feel like obviously apple trees can survive without any pesticide management. We see it happen in nature. The biggest thing that I can see to get to that point is the genetics of the trees. So as we weed out varieties that don't work, as we find new varieties in the wild, as we do on-farm breeding, we're going to continue to move towards orcharding that does not require any spraying, period. And especially if you have hard cider or any kind of processing as the outlet, because it doesn't matter if there's a worm in the core. It doesn't matter if you have scab lesions or plum curculio bites. So, and I do have a problem personally with too much alcohol production, right? We need food too. So if we can do breeding along with culinary apples as well, I think that I really do think that in a matter of 10, 20 years, we can have the genetic material to grow not only cider fruit, but culinary fruit with no need for spraying at all. It can be done. And so I feel like as we're talking about holistic orcharding, I'm moving towards that. This year, I sprayed 4 times in June, and it looks okay. I have a small crop, but again, the more we back off of the use of any inputs, the more our trees get used to living in an environment with no inputs or low inputs, and they adapt. It's kind of like, the intelligence of the tree. So if we start out with a system that is dependent on inputs of any kind, that's how the orchard is going to evolve and what it's going to become. So what Jason said earlier, it's best to start fresh. If we could plant a new orchard next year with 10 of the best trees to survive in a no-spray orchard, and we don't spray ever at all, I think we'll be successful. It's hard when you are going from the other direction. So you've already adapted the system to needing something, and you're trying to pull it away. So I think that's holistic thinking. And I guess I'll mention too, we've mostly talked about the above ground. The below ground is 50% of the tree. So I think in my scenario, feeding the trees with on-farm produced sheep compost and wood chips, which, building the soil. I think we need to build the soil so the roots can be happy and have good connections with mycorrhizal fungi, and therefore be more resilient.
People sometimes don't realize that most fruit varieties in orchards or farms are just not set up to survive on their own, and they never were. And so I think that's really the next big step is to think, research, and plan for how you can move towards either very low spray or no spray through precise farm planning and genetics and varieties, because that's really we're 100+ years past where we've really been able to kind of move in that direction. So now we basically have to kind of reset what the trees can do to get us to where we're going to be in a system that is capable of kind of surviving on its own and being productive and healthy and resilient.
You've alluded to this. So if you were starting fresh, and Eric, you mentioned some cider varieties that work, and and I guess some that don't. I guess Dabinette's on the doesn't work list. So if you were starting fresh, what would you plant and how would you plant it? If you had a clean slate, and would you include irrigation? Is that part of holistic, or is that too artificial? Because the last panel, there's a lot of talk about, well, maybe we need irrigation because of dry summers. So anybody want to take that about if you're starting fresh, I guess what varieties do work for your objectives? And the rootstocks, yeah.
I'm really big on Bud 118 right now because it's self-supporting. It produces a vigorous tree even when you have lots of other plant life thriving around the tree. So 118 is my rootstock choice with no trellis. And my spacing for that is 8 between trees and 13 between rows. And that includes the Fibonacci sequence. It's got the magic arc, so I feel like it's important. And it is also a setup that if you need to, 20 years down the road, you can remove every other row and have an 8 by 26, or every other tree and have a 16 by 13. And you would still have the benefit of 15 years of harvesting fruit, hopefully, if you're lucky. So that's my spacing, that's my rootstock, and I definitely install irrigation. I actually did this spring, by the way. So I installed irrigation. I have a farm pond, I have a pump, and I have drip irrigation because I don't think we can depend on rainfall, unfortunately. And the varieties are the wild selections from the wild, those 3 bittersweets. This is for me. It's different for everybody, right? Roxbury russet, golden russet, and believe it or not, Honeycrisp and Sweet 16.
Wow. Yeah. This is not about to be the reality of the orchard I plant anytime soon, probably. But I think the best move would probably be to plant out like pear seeds and just leave them alone. But in the reality of things, I'm always torn because there's like what are the climate adapted trees that I wanted that are easy to maintain and that can sort of fend for themselves. That's ideally what we would do. But also part of our project is maintaining even the difficult to grow varieties. So I'm sort of leaning towards regrafting onto Bud 118 and G890 and irrigation, like heavy irrigation, big infrastructure, and at least 2 years of soil prep. And varieties to be determined, but some of the old seedlings that are growing in our orchard, or the trees that are grafted from old seedlings, have been doing well, and some of the old Maine apples, Rolf, shout out to Rolf, Trescott is a nice grower for us. So is Gideon and Gray Pear Maine. There are others that stick out, but I think if I wanted an orchard that could sort of survive on its own, I would plant pear seeds.
The other rootstock I think of is the M111. I haven't heard a lot of great things about the Antonovka rootstock. I would like to talk to people about that for a lot of issues. But it may just be at a couple of sites. Varieties, Eric mentioned that Redfield. One I think doesn't get mentioned a lot, used to get mentioned a lot, is the Gold Rush. It seems pretty indestructible. Like the wild stuff too. All the russets seem pretty indestructible.
I definitely agree. If larger rootstocks, especially MM111 and Bud 118, are going to have just a much hardier and more resilient tree that's going to be able to survive these temperature and weather extremes that become more and more frequent. And even then, they'll be better able to handle droughts, but I think especially at least in the first few years, irrigation is going to be incredibly important. And I think that's a lot of things that can often get overlooked is those first few years, both before and after you plant, are incredibly important for just like getting a good start on a healthy tree. So making sure that you're really taking the time to properly prep your land, building up like the nutrients and the soil microorganisms, and then just planting correctly. Because if you start off with like a really healthy tree, and you can keep that going, you're going to have much less stress as a result of either weather or pest problems. So I think those are some big things that just can't really get overlooked. It's just like the health of the soil and everything else before you even put the trees in, and then continuing that through the tree's growth. And definitely I think nowadays, I don't think there's really any question about most places are going to need irrigation, and just really keeping your trees well watered for at least the first few years, and realizing that if you're going to be planting smaller, more dwarf-style trees, you're going to have to take a lot more care to keep them going compared to a Bud 118 or a larger rootstock. And locally adapted trees are great, and it's a very exciting stuff is happening there. But that's not always going to be what everybody wants to do. So I think that's where you just need to take the steps to ensure that your trees are as healthy as you can make them, and paying attention to what they need is really going to pay off, and just how resilient they're going to be when faced with just about anything.
If you shift the equation a little bit towards production and profitability, which is a perfectly fine thing to do, then I recommend what I did 10 years ago was planting 2 acres of tall spindle orchard on G11 and Bud 9 rootstock, because that will give you more fruit much quicker. It does take more upfront costs and more management, but if it's important for your lifestyle and business to bring in fruit in the next 4 years, then that's what I recommend. I really love my tall spindle orchard, by the way. It's beautiful.
I want to thank our panelists. I'm sure they'll be available for questions later, and thank you very much.
Wow, there was a lot to glean from this conversation, wasn't there? Once again, it was called the Holistic Fruit Growers Roundtable, and it was pre-recorded at Maine Apple Camp 2022. Maine Apple Camp is hosted by the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, and that can be found online at Maanka.org. The next Maine Apple Camp will be taking place in 2024. So do sign up for Maanka, their newsletter, and become a member too. They're doing really good stuff. I will say that I have an extra bonus Q&A from this particular conversation. They went on and were taking questions from the audience, and some of the things that they're talking about there is, how do you pay yourself? How do you pay yourself, and labor? So that was a really interesting conversation. And then also around what varieties that, in specific, it was directed to Eric, but everybody kind of chimed in, that you have on the tall spindle trees, and the difference between varieties there on dwarf and then, the high standard trees. Also another question about the no spray system, how that's set up, how it is designed, and also they got into environmental changes and lessons learned and planning for the next 20 years. There was a little bit more on that. That's going to be going up at the Cider Chat Patreon page, which is a website location that helps content creators like myself keep on doing the work that we're doing. And I am trying to build up the Patreon page. This podcast has been out there for, we're in our 8th year now, and still way below market kind of value for keeping the podcast up there. With a bit more funds in the bank, we'd be able to actually pay for the full data and get the Q&A out for everyone. that's just some of the things that we're looking at. So if you get value from this podcast, do consider becoming a patron. Google Cider Chat Patreon is spelled Patreon, or another option is to hit the donate button at ciderchat.com, and you could select whatever level on either of those sites that you feel you can commit to the podcast. Every little bit helps. Next week, we will begin rolling out the episodes recorded at CiderCon 2023 in Chicago. So if you haven't yet subscribed to this podcast or followed it on the different social media channels, this is your reminder to do so now so that you can get notified in your inbox or alert on your phone when those episodes are up and ready to listen. Because I don't know about you, but there is so much good news out in Ciderville worldwide. You want to keep up. I walk around when I'm out in my orchard or I'm just walking from one side of the yard to the other. I have my little phone just kind of playing in there, just catching up on different podcasts. Of course, obviously, I'm a podcast junkie. I just love it. I learn so much. And I also like knowing that you're coming along with me. And we're enjoying this experience together because it's a really amazing world out there, and we have a lot of abundance, and I like to keep my eye on a full cup, right? That's the way to think. Bring it, manifest it, make it so. And with that, I leave you here. This is Real Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Strange apples, bitter sharp. Strange apples, juicy and ripe. Bop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-doo-dop, bop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-doo-dop. Who wants a tannin balm?
I want a tannin balm.
Who wants to pull them down?
I'm gonna pull them down. Hey, 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 apples,
bittersweet. Strange apples, hanging high. Got them strange apples. Forget the pie. Strange apples, squeeze them tight. Got them strange apples. Strange apples. Strange apples. Make them pop. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-dum-doo-doo-dop, pop, 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 ba-da-dum-doo-doo-dop.
Who wants a tannin balm?
I want a tannin balm.
Who wants to pull them down?
I'm gonna pull them down. Hey, 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 apples. Come and see. Plenty strange apples for you and me. Strange apples. Strange apples. Strange apples. Make them pop. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-doo-doo-da. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-doo-doo-da. Pop, pop, pop. Ba-da-doo-doo-da. Pop, pop, pop. Pop, 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 pop.
Yeehaw!